Yes.
So 7 o'clock, actually it's 6:59, so we're a little bit early. So wait to introduce us.
I like that T-shirt, Sean. We have to get Kimmy.
You see that?
Yeah.
I resurrected it.
Yeah, I have two Kimmy, so I'll give you one.
Feeling gypped.
Yeah.
These are from way back when.
The elephant is there, so the elephant is there. So here we are at 7 o'clock. For all who are watching or who are going to watch after, thank you for taking time out of your day to join the conversation, to hear what we have to say, and hopefully leave some comments on the show. And this show in particular of Talk Forum is going to be on reparations. And we'll get into exactly what that looks like. But before we even dig into that, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Sean Spalding.
I'm Shauna Whittingham.
Kim Bankoff, hello.
Welcome.
Yeah, so as I was saying, this show is going to be on reparations, and there are many different takes on what that looks like to different people. I think the first thing that comes to mind would be financial recompense, right, to Black people, Black Americans specifically. But this is, I think it's more encompassing than that. But I think that would be the first place that we'd like to start off. Exactly. Let's define what reparations is. Shauna, can you share how you envision reparations? What does that mean to you?
So to me, reparations, I break it out in three parts. I break it out in, first of all, recognizing, so white America and Black America have to realize that there is current inequality due to past situations, basically slavery. We're going to get into this, but what was promised to slaves after the abolishment of slavery, which was reneged, and basically what that would value today. And then the second part is to basically agree about especially the financial or racial wealth gap, what that looks like, and assess that, bring that to current. And then lastly, paying it back in some way, shape, or form, which I'm sure we'll get into. But that's how I sum it up, basically.
Okay. Kimmy, what's your take? How do you see reparations? What is it?
So honestly, it's such a buzzword, and it gets people, turned up. And when you threw out this topic for this week, I was like, uh-oh, here we go. You say the word, and it's like there's a portion of the country or population that's like, absolutely not. And admittedly, I myself had never really put much thought into it. I think my own background or knowledge of, reparations was really, what you kind of hear the backlash, like, oh, we're going to cut someone a check, or, oh, we have to give people land. And so, the last week and a half or so, I started digging in and doing some reading. And I'm kind of viewing it as maybe not as technical, Shauna, as what you're describing, but more of a really pulling back, all the layers of the just laws and regulations, especially in the financial world, but housing, which is tied to finances. But there's so many aspects of society, whether it's housing, financing, the ability to get loans for businesses, right? All of those things are kind of structurally stacked against people of color, minorities. But specifically, if we're looking at the Black American population, they've never really been able to close the gap because structurally we're making it difficult, or in some cases impossible. So when I was kind of digging into reparations, it was more of kind of looking at the historical things that have happened along the way, where you mentioned, Shauna, things were promised at the end of slavery. Well, things were also promised during the Civil Rights Act, and things were also promised during the Fair Housing Act after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So there's been attempts, but everyone falls short. And so for me, just, to kind of summarize my thoughts, it's more of looking at all of the pillars that make up our society and saying what needs to change, how do we level the playing field, and then more so, level it for going forward, but certainly how do you make up for the last 3-4 generations who have not been able to accumulate wealth, have not been able to own houses, get business loans, and really kind of help bring them up like we have, the rest of society. So that was how I was viewing it.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot to that. I don't think there's one answer, right? I don't think it's cut a check. And I also think that the word itself creates such a backlash that maybe a rebranding is also needed around this concept.
Yeah, I think. Yeah.
What about you, Sean?
Yeah, that's a good point. A rebranding could be necessary. I don't know how people would receive that. I think it's important to note that I don't think that we're going to solve that here, right? Because the whole back reparations is a lot to unpack. But I just wanted to share something with everyone and anyone who's listening, is that typically we try and pick topics where there's a contrarian in the midst, right? Among the three of us, there's somebody that's going to disagree and doesn't see it the same way the other two do, or one, either way. But with this topic, it's safe to say that we all agree that in some way, shape, or form, reparations could be feasible or should be laid out. Is it fair to say that?
100% for me.
Yeah, I think we probably have very different opinions on how you get there.
Yes.
I think for me, as a white person who has not experienced these kinds of obstacles,
right.
Maybe you could say as a female, but I would never try to draw the parallels. I think it's important for me to more, learn, listen. But I do feel like if things are going to happen and move in this direction of some type of reparation, it needs to come from the community that's looking for it, and then needing the support of the majority, which is the voting, myself. Right. So that's kind of how so maybe yes, we all agree something has to happen, probably disagree on what that looks like.
Yeah, I think that's where the variance is going to be, is how that is mapped out. So my version of reparations, how I'd like to see it enacted, is not necessarily for financial recompense, because I think that is falling very short of what is owed, what I believe is owed, what I think is proper compensation for the ills and the sins of this country. And it's not. This is not going to be an attempt for me to come up with any guidelines, because the thing is, it's clearly laid out by the United Nations. The United Nations has has guidelines for reparations and restoration of rights, right? And I believe it's called the Guidelines on the Rights to Remedy and Reparations, and it comes in 5 parts. Only one of them being financial, and I'll read them off to you. So the first one being restitution, which is basically to restore the victim to their original situation, right? And that is another conversation in and of itself.
Yeah.
The second one is damages compensation, and that's where the financial component comes into play. So it's compensation for any economically accessible damage, right? And that's far-reaching, because we're talking about 246 years of slavery. But it doesn't stop there, because this is reparations, and that's another distinction I think needs to be made, is that reparations is not meant to, or in my estimation, reparations that I see as proper is not meant to compensate solely for slavery. It's also for what happened in Jim Crow, what happened during Reconstruction, what happened Jim and Jane Crow, right? During this the social and civil inequalities, right, that we were experiencing during the 60s and up until now that we're still experiencing, right? So that's another thing. The third part is rehabilitation. So that's in regards to medical, psychological, social services, and any legal assistance that's warranted based on the ills that took place. The fourth one is satisfaction, and that's truth seeking. And that, to me, is probably the most important one. I know that sounds strange, but But I believe that's even more important than financial compensation is the fourth part, which is the satisfaction, truth seeking, and public apologies, commemoration, things along those lines. So a public, very public assessment and a reworking of the way we teach ourselves, the way we teach our young ones, and the way we educate the populace. And I'm only speaking for this country. I can't speak for anyone else. The way we address that in this country. And the fifth part is guaranteed non-repetition. And I don't know that we've actually done that here. So that's a promotion of human rights standards and the establishment of mechanisms to prevent and monitor and avoid social conflict and conflict resolution. And I don't believe that's in place here because we don't have things in place to prevent social conflict, right?
So, go ahead, Shauna. I'm sorry.
No, I just thought, was that the end of the list, Sean?
Yeah, it's five.
Okay, so
those have yet to be met.
I'm okay with 4 of them. They can keep their apology. but quite frankly, I think the emphasis and focus really needs to be on the economics, the wealth, because when you look at the racial, the status of Black American families versus white, and the generational wealth, this needs to happen over time, needs to happen through development. One would argue about education, and there are things we can do there. Absolutely. Maybe Black Americans, let's back up for a second, because I put out on my WhatsApp a few days ago that we would be talking about this, and an affiliation I have, a friend, somebody I know and have done business with over the years. I mean, he came out and he asked me, he said, do you believe you're entitled to reparations? And I said, every single Black American is, in my opinion, is entitled to reparations. I am not Black American, however. So, we don't have time in this show to get into who, but I think it's really not that hard. There's studies out there. They can align Black Americans who are descendants of slaves in America. And I believe that these reparations, in whatever shape or form, should go directly to them. Not a group of people, not a society, not a neighborhood, but directly to them. 2/3 of college-educated Black people still make less than white families who haven't even graduated high school. So for me, that, forget the education, maybe paying it forward in that their college educations are paid for, their student loans are forgiven. I mean, those are we're not here to figure out the exact dynamic, but basically just to support. But I would like to support the argument that it is owed, it should be repaid. And when I say repaid or payment, I'm not necessarily saying cash payment, even though in some ways I am, because during COVID-19, the government was able to come up with trillions of dollars to offset what our society is going through. So they can come up. I don't think any other programs or any, I don't think any existing programs need to suffer, because one of the questions this friend asked me is, who should pay this? Okay, the government should pay it. And they can come up with the money, like they have come up with money for whenever there is a crisis. And I don't expect, or I wouldn't expect, or at least I would hope that no existing programs are compromised as a result of it. But I have a whole lot more to say, but I'll yield.
Yeah. Go ahead, Kimmy.
No, I was just going to say, I think, so I wrote down the 5 pillars because I hadn't heard that, or the 5 components. But I think there's each one, there's so many things that can be done. So Shauna, you just mentioned, and I think some of it has been done or attempted, right? So affirmative action. There are scholarships so that you're not, in student debt when you graduate. But the biggest thing, to your point, Sean, is, okay, well, now I've graduated. Maybe my college was paid for. Maybe I had grants. Maybe I have zero debt. But income equality, right? So now, no matter what I've done, I've the card stacked against me. I've made it through higher education. I still can't get a job that pays me this. So I think really we have to break down every aspect of society. I don't think it stops with just a check. And I will say, you hear the argument all the time, like my tax dollars and this and that. And I agree, our budget, there's always room. There's always efficiencies we can gain. There's areas where we can. This is the largest defense budget we've ever had. It's ridiculously blown up. There is money. My only thing with, a monetary is money runs out. And what happens when that check gets spent if structurally things haven't changed? So if I still can't get a fair business loan and start a business and have, fair rent or the ability to purchase, if I can't, if there's still discriminatory practices in place. So I think they all go hand in hand. I don't think one is more important than the other, but I think some areas suffer if you're not able to invest in all of these pillars simultaneously. And it does take time, but I would say that it has to go further than just monetary, because I think that runs out and you don't necessarily have a long-term view with that. But that's just, my quick thoughts on that.
I would tend to agree with you that it has to involve but exceed just financial. I know, Shauna, you had mentioned about they can keep their apology. I know that was a bit tongue in cheek, but the reason I think that that's a substantial component in affecting any kind of reparations is because there's a reason why we have pushback for things like affirmative action that attempts to level the field, right? And other programs that have been put in place to level the field. The reason why we have pushback is because people are in denial. Right. And they choose to be in denial, or you also have a group of people that are uneducated, especially on the history of the country and it's the history of how this country evolved, how it has created so much wealth, and on whose backs that wealth has been created. So this is why I believe that the apology has to take place, because involved in that apology is an acknowledgement. And I don't mean just signing a bill, because actually in 2008, there was an apology. There was an acknowledgement by Congress stating that the U.S. takes responsibility for the slave trade that they were involved in for 246 years, right? So there was one, but I guarantee that if I asked 10 people, maybe one of them, if I'm lucky, would know about that notation that was signed in 2008. And that therein lies the problem, is that we don't publicly acknowledge something, especially in this age of very low attention span. We really need to drive this home, so we don't have that question anymore. That like your friend Shauna that accosted you online said, do you agree with it? No, they shouldn't get any money. Then we could actually have a conversation, because then we would both be you'd both be equipped with the facts.
Yeah.
Right. Well, part of talking about short attention span, I agree with you, by the way, about that acknowledgement. And it was tongue in cheek, but I hear what you're saying as far as to even not have angst about it, because one of the questions was, what about the people who are wealthy? But, reparations for the Holocaust, reparations for Japanese for World War II, it didn't, they all got their $20,000. It didn't matter if a person was wealthy or not. So it doesn't matter if Oprah chooses to use her reparation, whatever, in the form of whatever payment, trust, endowment, that she donated, but is absolutely entitled to it. We don't get to pick, choose, and refuse. But dialing it back to the 4 acres and a mule, that each slave, the promise, Lincoln promised, and then Andrew Johnson, he reverses it after they murder Lincoln. Basically, I was listening to an economist, and the 40 acres back then is the equivalent in today's today's world, 40 million acres. And so back then when they did the assessment, basically only 40,000 slaves were given 40,000 acres of land. Mm-hmm. Really, what was supposed to be distributed was 5.3 million, which would have stemmed from basically South Carolina to North Florida, and none of that happened. So it's already been analyzed. It's already been studied as far as what was promised, even though that certainly couldn't have covered how slaves or what slaves contributed to this country, but that was what was agreed on. And I kind of want to talk about that. Reparations mean you acknowledge, I acknowledge, we come up with a term, and then that's it. There's no more, this is what we're agreeing to. It actually gets delivered. And then as long as there is no continuation of something such as slavery, then argument done. Now we're starting to level the playing fields. But the generational and the racial gap is way too wide.
Well, would you agree that there's certain factors in place that are also leading to that gap, not just social inequality? There are other factors. What would you lay all of the blame? In other words, with reparations, would you seek to cure all of these ills through reparations? Because
it would never get done, though. We have to pick a few, right, and start there. I don't think we're ever going to change a person's. We talk about this all the time. We're not going to change a person's mind, about how they look at another person or treat another person. So I think it's impossible to say we're going to address all of it, but we have to start someplace.
Yeah, I know about the quantifying of that 40 acres and a mule and coming up with a figure, and then saying in today's dollars what that would mean, and then dispersing that amount out to Black Americans that can trace their lineage back to their ancestors that were enslaved. But the problem with that is that when that 40 acres and a mule was assessed, that was after slavery. But reparations that we're discussing now is to encompass not just slavery, but everything else that took place after that. And also led to inequality, also led to deprivation amongst Black people. So you couldn't even use that.
Incarceration.
That's a scary conversation, because that figure, while that figure is, I don't remember exactly what it is, but that figure is high, it would still be even that much higher, because we'd be factoring in other things. And there's a minimum, right? Because the Black Americans is 13% of the population, but yet have 2.6% of the wealth. At a very minimum, we should be on. We need to create a balance. So for 13% of the population, then it should be 13% of the wealth.
Well, absolutely.
And that figure is enormous as well. Not to say it can't be done, but it can be done. The Germany after the Holocaust gave out the 70 billion to 800,000 Holocaust survivors. And at that time, that was quite a lot of money. That's quite a bit of money. No, so you just have to have the wherewithal and the buy-in from people, and that's why I believe the apology is necessary, because people have to have that buy-in, and not to just write on their guilt, but you have to write on the people's conscience, and that's why it's
a moral thing to do.
Yeah, the conscience of a is very important. But Kimmy, go ahead.
That's an ask that you can't necessarily expect. I don't expect people to have them. I mean, look at what we're dealing with today, right? To think that a public apology will all of a sudden, half the country who voted for this person is all of a sudden going to feel morally.
No, we're saying this person. We're saying this person. Okay.
But what I'm saying is, I don't know that they're. Yeah, I don't say. Yeah. They're not going to all of a sudden feel morally responsible, or if anything, they feel more detached. Right? I didn't do those things. That wasn't me. So I kind of, when Shauna said, keep your apology, I get it. And I feel that way as too, because I don't necessarily know that that's going to change people's minds. I think education is important. When I was thinking of satisfaction, I think a public apology, it rewrite the history books, reintroduce what you're teaching at the elementary schools, reintroduce what you're teaching in colleges, rewrite history to be more accurate and not so whitewashed. And that's how you start to plant seeds and change
the mindset.
Not, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and feel terrible. I can tell you, and we'll share some of those articles that I was reading on this topic over the last week and a half or so. Even as I am becoming more educated on the history, and not the big history, not the protests, not Martin Luther King marching on Washington, not the Fair Housing Act, but like the day-to-day events that were taking place. And it was changing my mind as I'm reading articles. And I'm more of a believer now than I was a week ago. And I've only begun to scratch the surface. So I think you get buy-in through education. And that's how I would view the apology, right? Is don't just say you're sorry, start telling the truth.
Right.
But going back to, there's pros and cons to things. And so I'll play a little bit of devil's advocate. If you gave me 40 million acres today, I would lose the land March 15th of 2021 because I couldn't pay taxes on that land. Right. So it's not as easy, right? Nothing is. But again, it goes back to, and we see a little bit of this with the Native Americans and the reservations. There are things you've got to, and maybe you do it a little bit better because you learn from past mistakes, but there are downsides to just handing without having the infrastructure in place to support.
So I want to talk about that because that infrastructure is absolutely key, because, there's an argument that, if we pay these payments in whatever way, shape, or form, that it would just basically go back to white America because there, lack of Black businesses, lack of, and so I agree with you that development, that infrastructure is what is key to allow for Black business, to allow for Black infrastructure, so that money is not separated, but then we begin the development of
Black community,
Black America, Black community. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not a zero sum game. It's not as though we and I'm afraid that a lot of times when this comes up, that you have those that tend to look at it as though, okay, so what, we're going to try and uplift the Black community, so that means it's taking away. Let's say it's the Latin community or the white community looking at it and say, so that's going to take away from our wealth. It's not a zero sum game.
Never.
It could be that all ships rise, right? And the other objection, because there's many, but another objection is, and this is a popular one, saying that I never owned any slaves, right? I wasn't even alive in the 60s, so I was.
They benefit and continue to benefit from it today. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Well, there's one thing to look at, and that to me, this is what drove it home, right? Because it doesn't make sense to address that, because if I put myself in somebody else's shoes, it is an argument that needs to be had. But what can really cut into the meat of that argument is the fact that we inherit wealth, right? There's generational wealth. So if the wealth of the father can be inherited by the son, why not the sins of the father be inherited by the son?
Thank you very much.
So
the story.
Anything wrong with it.
That's a good one.
And the story, I mean, there's 300 trillion wealth in the world. America has 100 of it, right? White America, 90%. Okay, so I get it. You didn't own slaves. Maybe you think maybe even your forefathers didn't. It doesn't matter. You benefited from it. And wealth is about being able to pass down. Wealth is about being able to get a higher standard education, or get an education and not come out in debt. It doesn't matter.
Well, Cory Booker had a good solution to that. It was, I don't think it covers everything, but it was his baby bonds initiative, which to really roughly explain it, not a rough shot over the whole policy. But my take on that is that his initiative would be for all kids that are, for all babies that are born in the Black community. Then they're given baby bonds. They're getting bonds that have a certain financial value attached to them, and that value does fluctuates based on the income of the family. All right, it's not.
I like that.
Yeah, and what that does is give them a leg up when they reach to maturity, and they can act on that. So whether that's going to be for education, whether it's going to be to open a business, they can act.
Right. I like it. And that could start. Sorry, Sean. That could start to repay when a Black man was incarcerated and Black woman was incarcerated, and they had a baby. They would sell those babies. They would claim that they were the property of the state, and so slave owners would come in and buy that baby. So maybe we can start to repay for those sins.
Yeah.
With that concept.
Yeah, yeah. And then you also have the option, you can go into to housing, and this is something I was thinking of as well. As a big determinant of someone's wealth in this country, and in many countries, is whether they own a house, whether they own a home or not. And that is most people, that's where the bulk of their wealth lies. So we could also do subsidies for housing. And that could be reflected in whether it's a very low interest in loans, whether it is less requirements to achieve these loans. So there are many ways to achieve this. And I said, we said at the beginning of the show that it's not an attempt to lay out exactly what needs to be enacted, but it's about making the argument for why or why not reparations are needed. But I have to ask a question, and I know that we're not going to be able to solve this. But my question is, how do we distinguish between who gets compensated for reparations? Because we throw in the term Black Americans, but it's a very broad term.
I think through lineage. I don't think it's that hard to figure out who has had an enslaved ancestor. America is very different today in that you have new immigrants like myself. I come from a different country, but I think if you identify, or America identifies you as Black American, or Black, they've been collecting this data for how many years now, and 23andMe is not that hard to get, but basically through lineage. I don't think it's that difficult at all to figure out who should get reparations.
Well, on the contrary, I think it is difficult. Because for people coming from a slave past, I don't know how good those records are. I know the records are very difficult prior to landing here, but even the records here, it's pretty difficult. I don't know. Kimmy, what's your take on it?
Were they destroyed?
So I'm a believer that whenever good is done for even the smallest portion of the population, everybody benefits. So when we are thinking about reparations in a structural way through, the financial systems, through different kinds of loans, right? All of these kind of programs that you're talking about, I think everybody benefits from that, right? I don't think that should be whether or not you are a descendant of a slave or not. I think the fact that you walk in a door with Black skin puts you today at a disadvantage or a different position than me walking through the door. So I don't necessarily think that you have to have descended to say that we know that you're being discriminated against today. And so therefore should all benefit from whatever programs and structural changes are put in place. When you're talking about monetary, so that's very specific, right? So now you're talking about an actual check or land, right? When you're talking about something very concrete like that and specific, then I think it does, have to go back to what is the intent, right? Is the intent that we are, paying back for the sins of slavery? Or Sean, to your point, is the intent that, hey, in the 60s, when your parents, right, were being born and your grandparents couldn't couldn't open a business. They couldn't send their kids to school. They couldn't, get jobs, right? Like, so that's a sin as well on this country. I don't think it ended with slavery, and I don't think we should be thinking about reparations just in that frame. I think it really needs to be looking at this holistically and saying, like, we've done really bad things as a nation. I caught myself, I almost cursed. But we, and so whatever changes happen, everybody should benefit from it, because everybody, when I say everybody, Black Americans are affected by it today.
Yeah, I just don't think there's any way to do that without setting up certain parameters. And I don't think, maybe they don't need to be exact. Maybe they can be broad, but some parameters would have to be in place, because I do believe that a financial cash payout is part of reparations. Because the simple reason is, why the hell not? Why the hell not? I really don't care how much money I have to begin with, because if I'm rich, if I'm already rich, and I'm walking on the street and you hit me, or I'm driving and you hit me with your car, I'm still going to come for you for compensation. Doesn't matter how much money I have already. So I believe there has to be some amount of financial compensation on a personal level.
Who negotiates that, right? Because we can say, yes, there should be a monetary value, and who decides that, and who agrees on that? So who represents these descendants to say, yes, we agree that $40,000 or $100,000 or $10,000? How do you see that coming together?
There's a House Resolution 40. There's a bill that they've been working on, and it definitely is flawed and needs more work. But there's a bill, basically.
That bill is to open the discussion on it.
To open, right? But, well, that's where we are. But speaking about opening the discussion, at first when they started talking about reparations, only 40% of Americans or whites were in favor of it. But now, they did a recent survey and it's 20%. Plus, half of millennials are in favor. So, we're getting there in terms of the acceptance, but it takes what we're doing here, which is the discussion, enlightening people, asking people to do research, us doing the research ourselves. But basically, reparations became part of politicians' conversations and arguments fairly recently. So, it's slow and it's making headway. We might be dead and gone before it's done, but let's just do the right thing.
Well, how do you combat somebody who looks at you and says, well, if we're going to give reparations for Black slaves, there have been many slaves throughout history. Shouldn't all peoples who had slave ancestry?
Well, I really not going to go down that rabbit hole with a person, because just like the Holocaust, just like Japanese, at the end of the day, you're never going to do it 100% the right way. But Blacks were brought here from Africa and were enslaved and built this country for free. Their children were stolen. And there's no disputing that something is owed to Black America.
Yeah.
That you said the numbers earlier. We make up 14% of the population, but only 2.6% of its wealth. That's a gaping.
Yeah, it's 13%, but yeah, the point taken, yeah. And I want to bring it up because there is, that's another popular argument against it. So you have to be able to combat and say, well, this is why this needs to be appropriated for Black people and why it shouldn't be appropriated to anyone else. But that centers around this whole thinking, like there's a victim awards. and I hear this discussion a lot where well, did blacks or black people more victimized than other people? Or black people more victimized than the Indians that were used as indentured servants, or the black people more victimized than the Irish that were also indentured? You know, there's all these false equivalencies that people throw out. I call them false equivalencies because to me there are. I don't think there's any.
Yeah.
But I like what Kimmy said. Everybody benefits.
In doing so, I'm also buying into the whole victim awards, but the facts are the facts.
Yeah, and the Native Americans, you know, did you know, this country did go through a process. You know, I don't know if it, I don't know enough about it. I don't know if it follows this sort of UN, you know, 5-pillar kind of model. I don't know exactly. I have to learn more about that and what, you know, how that came about. But they did get reparations. So when someone says, right, so we have done it as a nation, so we know it can be done. I really feel like it's great to know and see and hear about the millennials and the fact that there is, you know, more support around this. It may take another generation. But the fact that it's being discussed, the fact that there's a bill on the floor to even have discussions, the fact that millennials are behind it, I do think that it's a conversation to keep having and keep pushing. I know it's been, you know, the conversation's been around since forever. I know it was a big topic in the 60s. And so it's just, you have to somehow put structure around it and then push, right? And I think that's probably where we're at right now. I'm gonna actually research the bill and see. I need to know more about how the Native American population and the reservations came about and all of that, because maybe there's some knowledge to gain from that movement.
Well, I'll give you another one, and this is what really disgusted me, is that we're arguing over whether the country should pay reparations. The United States should pay reparations, but the United States has actually paid reparations before. They have.
Yeah.
Just that they haven't. It hasn't gone to black people. The reparations that they paid before, and I'm not talking about the Japanese, and I'm not talking about the Native Americans, but they have paid it in regards to African slavery. But it was paid to slave owners, and this was paid in 1862. It was Lincoln signed the Compensated Emancipation Act, D.C. District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation of 1862, and that was paid out the equivalent of, let's say, $8,000 per slave to all slave owners in and around the D.C. area.
Because in essence, they were losing their workforce.
Right.
And going back to 40 acres and a mule. So those 40 acres that they said they would give to the slaves, and when it got reversed after they killed Lincoln, they were giving white Americans 160 acres each during that time. So when they retracted the 40, so that's not 2 times.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's no denying it that at this point in 2020, if anybody is still denying the fact that there are structural and systematic racism and discrimination on a daily basis in every aspect of society, I don't, you know, I feel like if we're not past even acknowledging that and not moving in towards, okay, now what do we do about it? How do we fix this? Then that person is stuck in probably more ways than one. And
you would be surprised how many, I'm telling you, I mean, I'm going to try not to get emotional because there are people I know and associate myself with. And I was told just this week that America is not racist by more than one person. And they don't have my color skin. They don't experience what I experience, and proceeded to tell me where I should focus my energy and attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how you maneuver and tell people how they should feel about a thing, but there are, in regards to how much. Let's go back to the money part now. In regards to how much should be paid out or what should be paid out, there's always a hesitation. There's always that knee-jerk reaction because thinking is it's going to be a huge amount. Well, there's a reason you think it's a huge amount, because you damn well know it should be a huge amount. But that being said, there's also the case of outside of the U.S., I know we're speaking about the U.S., but outside of the U.S., there's been cases of double dipping where you have had there's no reparations that's been paid to Black people, but you also have a case where Black people in a free state have had to contribute to the paying back of like similar to the Compensated Emancipation Act, pay back to the government for the loss of their free labor. So in addition to being slaves before, once they're free, they also have to contribute to the paying back to compensate for the loss of their. So like in the UK, I remember when it was, but they passed a law, or there was a loan actually that was taken out to pay slave owners that was only recently repaid in 2015. Lloyd's of London just recently repaid in 2015 to compensate for that loss. And everyone knows about the fact that Haiti had to pay France for the.
We talked about that, right?
Yeah. For for the loss of their slave labor. Imagine that. And that was, I remember when that was finished being paid off. But that was recent. They actually.
If that don't fall under the category of thug, I don't know what.
I know it was like about 21 billion that Haiti had to pay back. You know, it's a poor country, poorest country in the hemisphere. But I don't remember exactly what the amount was. But I'm sorry, when it was finished being paid off. But the fact that it had to be paid is, I mean, that's just incredible.
And the fact that they couldn't do like a loan forgiveness, like once they got their heads on straight and realized like, wow, this is crazy.
Yeah. So there you go. But there's a lot of kinks that would need to be worked out if it's agreed upon that reparations are necessary from the United States. But my vision outside of just the financial is something that mirrors, and this again outside of financial, something that mirrors what took place in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation, what took place in Rwanda. It just coming to terms as a country,
right?
And just getting away from the whole discussion around money. I know I said it in the beginning, but I think that's probably the most important thing. And without knowing, our discussion here has centered more around trying to convince people, or the experiences that we've had in trying to convince people of the validity of the reparations discussion. And the reason for that is because there is a lack of acknowledgement. So I think to me, even more important than the money, we need to get buy-in, because once you have buy-in, you can move mountains. Once everyone buys in and realizes that, okay, this was an abomination, and this did take place, and I didn't realize I got my diploma from Harvard. I got my diploma from Georgetown. I got my diploma from Yale. I got my diploma from Princeton. And all of these institutions were founded on slave labor and slave labor and the funds derived from slave labor.
Right.
So not only built the damn foundations, but actually the labor that was extended, the funds that were accumulated from that labor built these institutions. So once we realize that, we realize how widespread, how encompassing this is, and then you can't escape it. There's no argument to be had.
Right. Maybe can be some kind of analysis done there too, and historically Black universities. We could talk about reparations there too, but I wanted to go back to the top of our conversation. I didn't know if we would have time to address this, but I find it happening way too often. So when we first started, Kimmy, and you were giving us your explanation of reparation, when you were wrapping it up, you mentioned there might be a need, just because of the knee-jerk reaction that people have when you even say that word, about rebranding. Truthfully, I'm exhausted with the deflection and distraction, because people are so sensitive about a term or if I have to hear one more thing about Black Lives Matter and why they're a terrorist group and they did the same thing with Black Panthers, it's like anything that white America doesn't agree with, for the most part, it's like there's all this distraction around the terminology. And that's exhausting to me. I don't understand why somebody would be in such up in arms if you say reparations. It means what it means. I don't understand why people are so like distraught when you say Black Lives Matter. It means what it means. Yeah. Oh, it should say Black Lives Matter too. Like, people are
they would say like defund the police, right? That's another kind of whoa.
It's a distraction. It's so that we spend our time justifying what it means, and I'm over it.
I do believe that language is important, but I get what you're saying though. It's too much focus being put on the lingo instead of actually focus being placed on the intent,
the concepts. Yeah.
And the concept.
No, it's one of those things where it can be, and I'm sure, it's exhausting. I can only imagine walking around and living it day in, day out. It's exhausting for me having the conversations, and I'm not, feeling it and experiencing it the way that you both are. But at the same time, there sometimes you do have to placate, and sometimes you do have to play the game a little bit to get ahead and to get things done and to move forward. And it's disgusting and it's annoying and it's, it shouldn't have to be that way. But if that's the reality, then I say, if you need me to be all soft and sweet and deliver it to you in a different word, I'll do that. If it's going to get me, to where I need to go. I struggle with it myself because I'm like I'm going to come in guns blazing, like this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm saying. And then it immediately puts people in a position where they're no longer hearing what I'm saying. And so unfortunately, it is something that as a movement, you need to be mindful of because, John Lewis, I think, said in one of his latest or one of the last public appearances, and I think, Sean, you mentioned it when we first started getting together, you run the risk of exhausting the people who you need to vote and move and push these things with you because you are a minority if you are pushing them away and exhausting them, right?
Yeah.
And it's not fair. It's not right. John Lewis said, he was afraid that some of these protests and the violence was going to become a distraction to the work that was being done, and it's giving folks ammunition. It's almost giving them an excuse to be like, no, I'm not interested.
Yeah.
It's sad that in his last few weeks when he was dying, like these were the thoughts that were going through his mind because he saw it in the 60s. But it's one of those things that if it may be a deterrent, and it may, I do think the defund the police slogan was a deterrent from the real work that's being done around restructuring the funding. So just, that's just.
I don't think you'd really escape any kind of thing that someone would want to latch onto to try and discredit a movement. They will always find a chink in the armor, but I think that you want to lessen those chinks. But there will always be a chink in armor that they'll find. It always brings it back to I wasn't alive, but it brings it back to the knowledge of Martin Luther King when he was doing his nonviolent protests, that there were, and being attacked with dogs, and those protests being attacked by the police and fire hoses and whatnot. And they were trying to do a nonviolent protest. And I'm sure they had people within the movement that were fed up and they were lashing out also. But the overarching theme is that they were nonviolent. But during that time, while he was alive, he was being viewed as a race baiter, as someone who's sparking the wrath. He was sparking violence. He was not looked at in this deified view that we look at Martin Luther King these days. He was not looked at then. it's only in post-mortem that we identify him like that.
But the same thing is happening present day with Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, and
they're villainizing.
It's more truncated now because you can see that for the most part, Colin Kaepernick was the bane of many people's existence, and now they're turning back and look at him and say, "Well, he was onto something." Wow, imagine that. He was onto something, right? But I just wanted to touch on this before we close out. Is that I know we said several times we made reference to either white America or black America, and I don't think the lines are that distinct because I do know many black people that are against reparations, and I have my feeling on why they are against the reparations, and I know many white people that are for reparations or some kind of compensation. So the lines are very blurred. It is a matter of it's not just color. It's a matter of one, socioeconomic position. It's also a matter of how engaged you are and how educated you are on the topic. So it's not just along color lines.
Yeah, I just use the color for the simplicity of the conversation. But no, I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
I've had Black people tell me that we don't need what is it when you have to have a certain percentage of Blacks in your business?
Affirmative action.
Yeah, I've had Black people tell me we shouldn't have affirmative action.
Well, I think that goes back to being uneducated about what that is, because affirmative action was really people who benefited the most from it was white women. So I mean that's a whole nother subject. And so
right.
White women have always benefited from the work and the pushing of the African American community for progressive change in this country. We have been the biggest benefactors.
Thank you for acknowledging that, Kimmy.
And it's why I get so frustrated. I'm in a white suburban community. And I don't think that is recognized. I don't know if because they are not working in the workforce. I don't know if because now we've come a few generations, and so we are the children of white women who maybe, right, so we haven't personally experienced it. We're the grandchildren maybe of white women who did, but reproductive freedoms, just so many things that are taken for granted. And it really, when we talk about acknowledging and apologizing, I mean, really it starts, with my demographic.
I'd like to thank you for acknowledging that publicly, because that is 100% true, and I appreciate. That's why I like you. That's why I'm.
I love you.
Let me second that as well. Yes, that is so the acknowledgement of that. That's one. That's a step towards other people realizing that yes, that's a thing. That's a thing. But I also noticed that when I come across Black people, for example, that are against the notion of reparations, they always stem to come from, whether that's in their imagination or whether that is true and in fact, they always come from an area of more success, right? They believe that they have achieved some semblance of the American. Yeah, they've made it. They're living the American dream. They're not wanting. They may not have everything they want, but they have everything they need, right? They're living a comfortable life, and there's danger in that, because when they get to that point, and this is not the first time it's happened in history. Du Bois spoke about that. It's when we get to that point and we start to look at ourselves as, why can't you do it just like I did? That's when it gets dangerous. The education is necessary. But I think we've reached time, right?
Yes, sir.
Wow.
Yeah. We could go on for quite more time. Probably another hour.
Maybe we could do a part 2.
Huh?
Maybe we could do a part 2 to this sometime down the road.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea.
Yeah.
I think that would be warranted. But again, I appreciate you ladies joining me in coming together so we can have this discussion on reparations. And I think we covered quite a bit. So I want to thank you guys and for allowing me to have this discussion. And thank you to everyone that joined in and who will be watching once we post. And if you have any comments on any missteps that we made, or anything that you disagree with, or anything that you do agree with, or you just want to tell me to shut the hell up.
Never. I could listen to you all day. I want to say thank you to the both of you too, and just remind our audience, whether you're watching this now or later, to make sure that you follow Talk Forum on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram.
Indeed. Thank
See
you.
you in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Ciao.
Bye, guys.